Welcome to The Story. I'm Evan Watson in for Pat Doris this week. Tonight, we're looking at power companies, wildfires, and your future risk. Because it doesn't take an expert scientist to know that climate change has been and will continue to affect us here in the Pacific Northwest for years to come. There's a process playing out in front of Oregon's utility regulators that we should all be paying close attention to for the sake of our bank accounts and for accountability. It's our big story tonight. First, for context, this summer a jury found Pacific Power liable for some of the historic 2020 Labor Day wildfires, the Santiam Canyon fire being one of those. In total, the 2020 Labor Day wildfires are the most costly in Oregon history, burning more than 1 million acres statewide. 9 people died, thousands of homes were destroyed. State and federal investigations are still ongoing. Pacific Power was ordered by the jury to pay $90 million in damages to 17 plaintiffs, and the company will likely pay many millions more as part of the class action elements of the lawsuit. Since then, Pacific Power has asked regulators for relief. First, by opening the door for the company to request to raise customer rates to cover litigation, losses potentially down the line, and then recently requesting to reduce the company's potential liability for future wildfires. Today, regulators looked at Pacific Power's latest request, and no matter which power company you use, this is a process you should be watching closely.
This application seems to raise a mix of legal and policy or factual issues.
Months after a jury hit Pacific Power for $73 million in damages, with many millions more still to come, the utility company wants to limit its liability in future wildfire-related lawsuits. Regulators with the Oregon Public Utilities Commission say they need to investigate this request. That investigation could take up to 9 months.
Our job is to decide difficult issues affecting ratepayers and the public interest.
Mike Getz is an attorney for the Oregon Citizens Utility Board, which advocates for consumers.
This is the broadest and most sweeping liability waiver that I've ever seen filed. And it's no question that it's coming in the wake of the verdict that was just rendered by the Multnomah County Court.
Getz says consumers should be able to seek damages from power companies if they're found to be responsible for starting or spreading wildfires. Plus, the timing of this request can't be ignored.
And we feel that now is not the time for a utility that was just found to be grossly negligent to try to be precluding future customers from potential injury and liability from facts and cases that are not yet known.
Pacific Power attorneys say a limit on liability is necessary because the increased risk of wildfire means power companies are now more exposed to litigation. The filing notes that PacifiCorp's credit rating dropped after a jury found the company to be negligent and reckless during the 2020 Labor Day wildfires. A Pacific Power spokesperson told KGW, "We believe a reasonable limit on liability, as allowed under Oregon law, would be a net benefit to Oregon customers, as it would shield them from some of the costs associated with wildfire litigation." The problem with that, there's no guarantee that Oregon customers would ever be hit with the costs of wildfire litigation. As a regulated utility company in Oregon, Pacific Power must get approval from the Public Utilities Commission for any rate changes, explaining exactly how and why rates are going up. At this point, Pacific Power hasn't requested to pass on litigation costs to consumers, but the company has left the door open for that if regulators approve a different request from June.
We're fighting that proceeding, and we don't think that there's precedent for those types of costs to be included in rates, and we're optimistic that the commission will deny cost recovery when the company comes in and requests it.
The big picture is PacifiCorp says power companies in the West are now more at risk of getting sued and being found responsible for wildfire damage. Climate change is a big factor. The Multnomah County jury's verdict may have set a legal precedent, too. So will regulators allow power companies to significantly reduce their liability in the future? Is such an ask even legal? And if Pacific Power asks to raise customer rates to cover its losses, will regulators let that happen?
I have faith in the Oregon Public Utility Commission's ability to scrutinize these types of filings and to uphold the public interest.
In response to today's decision by regulators to investigate, a Pacific Power spokesperson told me this afternoon that wildfire liability is a critical issue that requires holistic solutions, and the company welcomes the PUC's decision to further explore this issue as part of its process. Now, Do you have something to say about this? If you want to say it directly to the regulators, you can. We have a link to these filings in this story on our website, kgw.com. You can also contact the Citizens Utility Board. They're also always looking for more opinions from engaged customers. And lastly, we want to know what you think too. We love hearing your opinions. You can email the story at kgw.com or call and leave us a voicemail at 503-226-5090. Now let's get to a story that we think is worth your time. It was published in the Oregonian over the weekend. High bar for hospitalizing mentally ill Portlanders without consent leaves those in great need on the street. The headline explains it well, but the first two sentences of the article lay the groundwork for what's to come. LB, who is 60 and unhoused, is unlikely to make it through the winter. She can often be found sleeping under a blanket in an old town doorway, not understanding the very real threats of frostbite and hypothermia, even as temperatures drop. It chronicles the unbelievably sad and miserable situation for a schizophrenic homeless woman whose initials are LB. And it was written by the Oregonian reporter who covers the homeless crisis, Nicole Hayden. We caught up with her yesterday to ask how this story came together.
We launched our mental health reporting project a few months ago, and I had mentioned to the Blanchet House director just when I ran into him one day about that, and he mentioned that there was a woman they had been working with that I might be interested to hear about her story. And so I just sat down with some of their staff members and started learning about the challenges they were having getting LB, just basic treatment. And it went from there. So I spent months checking in with them.
The story that unfolds in Nicole's reporting is anything but uplifting. And some of it mirrors issues that I've talked about in my series Uncommitted, talking about the high bar required to commit someone for mental health treatment against their will, civil commitment, as it's called. Every case is different, but in LB's case, Multnomah County state-certified civil commitment investigators ruled 5 times in the past year that LB does not meet the criteria, leaving LB's few advocates at Blanchet House and Nicole stunned.
Definitely my jaw dropped a lot in the course of reporting the fact that the minimal help that she was getting kind of disqualified her from getting more help. So the fact that, she constantly soils herself, which is not sanitary, and at times that could be some evidence for civil commitment in certain cases. But since she was having these workers go above and beyond their typical duties and helping her get showered and whatnot, kind of showed that she had help and, she wasn't going to perish all alone. There was someone fighting for her, and that kind of seemed like a catch-22.
Getting help on an immediate basis, potentially preventing her from getting help on a more permanent basis. Another element is that whenever LB would receive mental health treatment on a temporary hold, she responded quickly to medication to treat her schizophrenia, and after a few days of treatment, the hospital would ask if she wants to continue treatment. She told them she wanted to go home, not understanding that she does not have a home to return to. Instead, she would show up back at Blanchet House with a bottle of medication she refused to take, thinking it belonged to someone else. And it's worth noting that LB does not use any substances. She's not high when acting erratically. It's mental illness. Nicole discovered through her reporting that LB is certainly not the only person like this on Portland's streets, but the civil commitment laws, as they're written in practice now, can lead people like LB to literally cling to life as they survive on the street. On that note, an Oregon Judicial Department work group has been meeting monthly over the last year studying civil commitment. I caught a recent meeting, and they're expected to recommend changes to Oregon's laws in the spring. Of course, that takes time, but we're still tracking that closely. But Nicole's story in the Oregonian is worth a read. It is not behind a paywall. You can read the whole thing for free right now. Just visit OregonLive.com. Governor Tina Kotek is coming up on 1 year in office, and one of the biggest issues of her campaign was tackling the housing crisis. 11 months later, she says she's probably not going to meet one lofty goal for getting people back into housing. Earlier this year, the governor passed an emergency order aimed at preventing homelessness, expanding shelter capacity, and rehousing people. Now, it looks like she is going to get close to meeting 2 of her 3 goals. According to data from Oregon Housing and Community Services, they're just under 80% of the way to adding 600 new shelter beds. 475 have been created as of September, and about halfway toward the goal of preventing 8,700 people from becoming homeless. Right now, they prevented just over 4,300 people from losing their homes. But when it comes to getting people into housing from shelters, only a little over 200 families now have homes. In Multnomah County, it's only 4. That's far short of the goal of rehousing 1,200 households by January.
We're on track, if not exceeding our goals around building new shelter capacity. We're doing a really good job about eviction prevention. I think we had systems in place. The rehousing effort has been the hardest one. Some of that relates to our housing crisis. We literally don't have housing in some communities when people have transitioned and gotten stable to go into housing. It's really hard. I'm having individual conversations with stakeholders to help us out. Landlord groups, housing authorities, other folks to say, what can you do more to help us get folks rehoused? I will tell you, I think it's the number that's going to be hard to meet in January. And that is a direct reflection of the lack of housing, affordable housing that's available in communities. But we're going to keep trying.
Governor Kotek says that during the upcoming legislative session, she's going to ask legislators to pass about $600 million in one-time funds aimed at housing production. She says it's her #1 priority. She's also pushing for longer-term rent assistance to help keep people housed after they come out of shelters and into housing. Also coming up during the session, potential changes to Measure 110. Earlier this month, a group of Oregon Republicans sent a letter to the governor calling for changes to the law that decriminalized drug use. They want criminal penalties to return for possession, including mandated treatment, as well as a ban on public drug use. Earlier this year, a coalition of business leaders called for similar changes, or they said they'd bring an initiative to next year's ballot. Another lawmaker has asked the governor to call a special session to figure out 110.
I'm not calling for a special session. The session is coming up. We're right on top. It's coming very quickly. That's where we're going to find solutions. That's why I'm focusing on the Joint Committee on Addiction and Community Safety. I think that is the place where we're going to come up with the solutions, whether it's banning public use, dealing with some of the issues that law enforcement has and being able to get drugs off the streets. I am open to what comes out of that committee. It's a priority for Oregonians, and we have to understand how we get this system to work better for people and keep our communities safe.
We're also keeping an eye on the governor's Central City Task Force. That's the group of local leaders convened to come up with solutions for downtown Portland. They're giving their recommendations in less than 2 weeks, and you can bet we'll be watching. Up next on The Story, another follow-up to Pat's Tainted Water series. He told you all about nitrates in the groundwater in parts of eastern Oregon. Now the EPA is warning about elevated levels of so-called forever chemicals in dozens of areas across the Pacific Northwest. Details when The Story returns. In Pat's Tainted Water series earlier this month, he talked about how the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has been light-handed with the state of Oregon when it comes to nitrates in well water. They've only sent some strongly worded letters, but they have been studying water sources around the country to see if they are contaminated with PFAs, otherwise known as forever chemicals. They found nearly 24 areas in the state of Washington with elevated levels, several here in Oregon and some in Idaho as well. PFAs are harmful to our health, and solutions to get rid of them are not cheap. Kristen Goodwillie from our Environment Northwest team explains.
In a massive countrywide study, the EPA now has an idea of which harmful contaminants, called forever chemicals or PFAS, are found in public water systems.
This is just the first wave of reporting across the country, and it's only about 15% of the sites that are being tested.
Phil Thompson is a professor of civil and environmental engineering at Seattle University. He says these contaminants are organic chemicals in fire retardants or nonstick coatings on pots and pans.
It turns out that if you are exposed to them, they can be very toxic.
According to the EPA, exposure can increase certain cancer risks, among other ailments.
Really, if you can measure PFAS, that's going to be problematic health-wise.
The EPA highlighted water systems that detected contaminants above its minimum reporting level. We created a map showing varying degrees of color, with the darker shades indicating the highest levels. Some of the worst contaminant levels are at JBLM, Artendale near Gig Harbor, and Sammamish Plateau water.
Unfortunately, it's something that we found in our water in 2016. And we've been trying to understand what we need to do to address it.
According to General Manager Jay Krause, the levels tested for Sammamish Plateau water are below Washington state guidelines. The EPA has proposed regulations, but nothing official, and treatment options are costly.
The challenge is, though, just making sure a $40 million investment accomplishes what we need to meet these regulations.
It's a financial burden Thompson says will impact everyone.
It's going to be a very costly development for the whole country in terms of the amount of treatment that's going to be required, or just switching people to different water sources is going to be very expensive.
Not only are these treatment options costly, but can take years to build and implement. That's why Krause says it's imperative that federal regulations are firmly in place. For Environment Northwest, I'm Kristen Goodwillie.
And if you'd like to see what was found in the water in your area, we have an interactive map on our website right now that points out where the EPA found these forever chemicals. Just head to kgw.com or the KGW News app. Now to Measure 114, Oregon's gun control law that was ruled unconstitutional by a state court judge last week. Yesterday, we shared some of your thoughts on that ruling, and a few dozen people have already commented on our YouTube video with opinions of their own. But let's show you the expected path ahead for 114, because as we've told you several times, this is far from over. Last week, the Harney County judge at the circuit court level deemed it unconstitutional and placed a permanent injunction on the law, meaning it cannot take effect unless a higher state court judge overrides his ruling. The state will appeal to try and do just that. And the next court is the State Court of Appeals. But in some cases, the Oregon Supreme Court can be asked to expedite a ruling and take a case instead of waiting for the appeals court to weigh in. There's speculation that could happen here. If that happens and the state Supreme Court agrees with the Harney County judge, well, 114 is dead. But if they throw out the Harney County judge's injunction, then 114 has a path forward. But that depends on what happens at the federal level. So far, a federal district court judge has ruled in favor of 114, saying it is constitutional as it relates to the U.S. Constitution. But that ruling is being appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. That court will influence next steps. But many speculate that whichever way they rule, there's a real possibility that this case is appealed again, finding itself before the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court. And as the justice system is designed, they would have the final say on whether 114 is constitutional in regards to the U.S. Constitution. 114 would need wins in federal and state court in order to be implemented. So for those of you hoping it will take effect, there is a way forward, but it will not be anytime soon. Needless to say, this is not the last you've heard about Measure 114. You can count on us on the story team to bring you every update. Up next on this story, today is Ashley Corson's last day at KGW. But she has one more story to share after more than a decade on the air here in Portland. How a local nonprofit's mission to build inclusive playgrounds has spread around the globe when the story returns. Having a playground in a neighborhood can be vital for some families with children. Most parents would agree a good playground is a game changer. But for kids with different abilities, finding a place to play can be tough. A local nonprofit, however, has been working to change that for over a decade, building inclusive playgrounds. It's called Harpers Playground, and this fall they completed their biggest project yet in Vancouver. Ashley Korsland spoke with the co-founder about how the work being done here in the Pacific Northwest is taking hold around the world.
It started as a goal of making play accessible for all and has grown into a worldwide movement of inclusion.
Inclusive is a goal, really. It's like the North Star.
It's the dream held by Cody Goldberg and his wife April, who in 2010 realized their daughter Harper couldn't use the playground in their North Portland neighborhood.
Typical playgrounds with the wood chips don't work for kids who use wheels to get around, and that's what kicked all of this off.
Thus, the nonprofit Harpers Playground was born, established to create radically inclusive playgrounds, beginning with Portland's Arbor Lodge Park.
But when we started Harpers Playground, Harper was 4 and Lennon was 1.
Harper is now 18 and younger sister Lennon 15. As the girls grew, so did the mission.
We can trace our DNA to 19 different playground projects throughout the world. The furthest away from here is in Tokyo, Japan.
And their biggest project to date is Marshall Park in Vancouver, which held its grand opening this September.
6 years, $4.3 million. This is by far the largest and most complicated project we've ever taken on.
Complete with bronze sculptures and handcrafted mosaics that each tell a story.
And it really is about both story, but also tactile.
A sand area called Lennon's Land.
And kids just love rolling, sliding, tumbling.
And of course, the one-of-a-kind Harper's Hill.
All the pieces make a kid's experience here really unique each time.
Harper's Playground also helps cities around the world create their own inclusive playgrounds. Next up, designing 2 spaces in Bothell, Washington, and one at Foot Soldiers Park in Selma, Alabama, in honor of the Civil Rights Movement. The John R. Lewis Memorial Playground is set to open in 2025, marking the 60th anniversary of the Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights.
I'm pretty sure I'll be at a ribbon cutting ceremony along with Barack Obama, and Michelle will be there, and probably Oprah.
For Cody, it's surreal to think about. After all, it's taken a lot of time, growth, and tears to get here. But Harper's Playground has also brought the Goldberg family immense joy and gifted them with lifelong relationships.
I think I'm most proud of all the friendships. The mission is so pure. It attracts some really amazing people.
People who share a common belief that play should be accessible for everyone. Because play really is the heart of a community.
I hope that we go out of business knowing that the world is a much more inclusive place for everybody.
Ashley Korsland, KGW News.
Just warms your heart, doesn't it? Harper has her playground, but sister Lennon does not yet. Cody promised her that she would have a park by her 16th birthday. She's 15 now, so it's getting down to the wire, but Cody plans to take her to New York City soon to pick a location for a park named in her honor. Well, that is the end of our show. Thank you for watching. The good stuff is coming your way next. And be sure to tune in tomorrow for our big story on ambulance response times. Ambulance provider AMR finally agreed to sit down with me for an interview. Let me tell you, this has been a year in the making, and a lot of emailed statements have gone by. And you can bet we had plenty to talk about, and they had plenty to say. All of this coming up tomorrow at 6:30. We'll see you then.